But thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Karen, for inviting me. It's really nice to be back talking to Healesville CoRE because I love what this organisation does. I think the work is so valuable. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So, yeah, I do have a slide about myself. So I guess, like, who is this girl, and like, why is she here talking about the COP, and what experience does she have? And it's a good question. I don't think I would call myself an expert on the UNFCCC's sort of machinations and how it all fits together, but I've done my very best to try and put it in a nice logical sort of sequence and just give the high level overview, because it is pretty exciting for Australia to get the opportunity to host a COP. It's been described as the biggest international event next to the Olympics. It's a huge undertaking, and it's probably one of the most well-known United Nations conferences we have currently. So yeah, for my real job, I'm a policy advisor for the Deputy Secretary. I work in bushfire policy, and I also get to respond as a forest firefighter in emergencies. Global Voices is the whole reason that I get to go overseas to these conferences. I started myself as a policy fellow. The organisation puts together youth delegations to upskill them in policy and international decision making, and then they come back to Australia and they write policy for Australian recommendations. So other than that, I also volunteer on the board, like Karen said, of the bank, but this is kind of my COP journey, which unwittingly started in 2015 when I was 22 years old. I just moved down to Melbourne to start my environmental science degree, and somebody was saying, like, it's going to be a big year in the climate space. There's going to be this big conference in Paris, and they're going to make, you know, the Paris Agreement. It's going to be sort of landmark. And me being kind of the weird young adult that I was like, I'm going to fly myself over there and be there. So I saved up my cheesecake shop money, and I flew over to Paris. That's me as a climate angel in the middle. I wasn't actually allowed inside the conference centre. It was very locked down at that stage. So we stood out on the steps and were trying to advocate for 1.5 degrees, which was eventually allowed into the text. So the climate agreement that they came to in Paris does outline 2 degrees with a hope to limit to 1.5. We know now that 1.5 has been reached, and it was kind of a farce, target. But nevertheless, it was kind of the first time that young people had been involved in the climate conversation, and it was definitely the youth that pushed 1.5 forward into the text. The next time I went was, like I said, as a policy fellow. I went to Egypt in 2022. It was an interesting COP in terms of being hosted by, one of the nations of Africa. There wasn't a lot of movement on the text. The year before, 2021, there was the Glasgow Agreement, and that was where they started to talk about a loss and damage fund, and that was kind of a landmark agreement. And I'll get into the loss and damage fund a little bit later, but that was actually ratified at the Sharm el-Sheikh conference. And then last year, as a program manager for Global Voices, I went to Dubai for the COP and led the youth delegation there. Global Voices, we presented at the UNFCCC, which was really cool. But again, being hosted by one of an oil-rich nation, it makes it really difficult to get progress because, as I'll explain, it really depends on the country who's hosting to push those texts forward. And if the president of the COP or the hosting country doesn't want to see a lot of movement in the texts, they just won't they won't get there. So even when countries are really pushing for things, the host is the one who drafts the text. They define the starting line. They also define what goes into the negotiations on the draft texts. And so if they don't want to push forward with anything, they probably won't, which is why it's interesting to think maybe Australia would be the president and to think about what would happen. So tomorrow I actually fly off to Azerbaijan to go to the COP29. This COP, again, it's kind of a contentious COP. It's an oil-rich nation. We're not expecting a lot, but we are hoping to sort of ratify some agreements that were drafted last year and during the Bonn intercessionals, which was earlier this year. This is as simplified as I could get it. What is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? How does this COP happen? And this is kind of how it all works. So in 1997, 197 countries signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. Australia was one of the countries who signed on, but it wasn't actually ratified until Kevin Rudd came into power in 2007, and it was one of his first sort of acts as Prime Minister was that he wanted to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And the protocol essentially acknowledged that climate change was human-induced and that the richer countries would have to limit their emissions, so, for the good of the rest of the world, essentially. But it was very light on. And in that protocol, those parties have to meet every year. So that's kind of subbed into this conference of the parties. The Paris Agreement that we just talked about has essentially the same layout. They have to meet every year, and so the UNFCCC, under the auspices of the Conference of the Parties, kind of those two things happen simultaneously, and that's where we see the different types of negotiation texts. Through that annual meeting, the purple meeting, which is the COP that we refer to, that is where the sort of landmark decisions are made. Work is doled out to those two bottom subsidiary bodies. So there's the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, and the subsidiary body for implementation. So a lot of people would know about the IPCC. That's a subgroup of one of those implementation committees. They sort of give an annual report, and they also work out the mechanics of, okay, fine, it's great that we're all going to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but what does that actually look like on the ground? And that's their job, and they're sort of they're like the public servants of the UNFCCC, trying to figure out how that actually looks on the ground. And they meet twice a year. First, they meet at the COP, and then they also meet at the Bonn intercessionals, which happens around kind of July every year. That's as simple as I can get it. The rules of the procedure, and that this is what the president of the COP has control of. So they sort of guide consensus and ensure that consensus is reached on the text. So they are the chairs of the negotiations. They define the meeting protocols. They define which observers are allowed into the negotiations, which aren't. And then they also define the codes of conduct for each COP. So this year, the key negotiation topics will be climate finance, will be a big one. So they have the NCQGs, which is the New Collective Quantifiable Goals, and that is going to replace the $100 billion target that was set in 2009 that was not met. And essentially, the original purpose of that goal or that money was to help lower income countries sort of skip the fossil fuel transition and just jump straight to renewables and new technologies and kind of, kickstart that. Countries over the next, almost 20 years just argue back and forth about who should pay what and who should get what, and it didn't really ever come to fruition. So that's kind of what this new collective quantifiable goal is being introduced as, a methodology that will hopefully work, but that's kind of a wait and see, what is it going to look like? The loss and damage methodology, so this is what was ratified last year, the year before in 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so that was an agreement between all countries that richer countries have become rich off the back of, mining and exporting and burning fossil fuels. That's why they have so much money. And the lower income countries that haven't had that opportunity, they are the ones who are at highest risk of, climate events like natural disasters, and they are less likely to be able to overcome those. Pakistan had those $40 billion floods. We know that that was exacerbated by climate change. So who pays for that? Should it be those countries or not? So that's what the Loss and Damage Fund is supposed to do. There's some controversy around it. Sorry, I've put white text on blue background, which is not very nice of me. So that says, how can we determine what is exacerbated by climate change and how can this finance be distributed? So this is what they will define this year, hopefully. There's a bit of controversy around grants versus loans. Usually they would adopt a World Bank-esque kind of Bretton Woods status where you give out a low interest loan, but you're still sort of committing those low income countries to a lot of, debt and stress. And so these countries have pushed back this time and said, no, I think it should be more like a grant. We shouldn't have to, pay back with interest. There's the nationally determined contributions, the NDC. So that's essentially the emissions reduction targets. Every country's emission reduction targets get refreshed next year. So this year is trying to figure out who should be recalibrating to what. Are we going pre-industrial levels? Are we baselining at 2009? Are we baselining at 2015? So that's what will be worked out this year. And then there's the global goal on adaptation. So what does adaptation look like? And how can the needs be locally defined? So, African nations are really looking for better adaptation standards on agroforestry, and they're looking at food security, mostly water security, whereas the other countries are more like disaster resilience, technology upgrades, those sorts of things. So how can we define adaptation, and how can we ensure that every country is able to adapt in the way that they need to adapt to face the outcomes of climate change? So the bid for the COP31, which would be in 2026, is between Australia co-hosting with the Pacific, and Turkey is also a country who has put their hand up and they would like to host. There's sort of a rotation. It's a very loose rotation, but it's sort of, if we can, we would like the COPs to rotate through these certain regions. So it goes Africa, the Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and then Western Europe and others. Australia falls under Western Europe and others. But really, if we were going by the order, it should be an Asia Pacific hosted conference. The Pacific doesn't have that many options for hosting a COP. In Dubai, I think about 500,000 people attended across the 2 weeks, and so you need accommodation and the resources and the means to be able to host that. So Australia's put our hand up that we would host it on behalf of the Pacific. So we would host it in Australia. Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, and Brisbane have all sort of expressed interest in being the cities to host. And that kind of won't be worked out until we actually win the bid. So the bid will be announced next week. I had a pretty picture there, but it's gone. Damn. So Australia's proposal primarily is to build partnerships with the Pacific. So currently Australia has a lot of programs to uplift the Pacific in terms of, you know, helping them adapt to climate change, but we already know that places like Tuvalu, Kiribati, they will be completely underwater. They're only just a metre above sea level, and, you know, Tuvalu is already looking at digitally remaking the island in the clouds because they know that the next generations, it'll just be water, there won't be anything left. So there's kind of this tension between the Pacific, they want Australia's help, but also we have very misaligning views. Australia is rich because of fossil fuel exports, so we have to figure out how we're going to kind of meet in the middle there. So the controversy and the, I guess, the tension stems from fossil fuel exports from Australia. We need to strive for a phase out of fossil fuels. Australia voted against the wording phase out last year, and instead we kept phase down fossil fuels. So that was like a big ask from the Pacific that we would vote on behalf of them for a phase out. We didn't do that. We still have 116 new gas and oil exploration projects in the approvals pipeline that the Environment Minister is looking at approving. There's also worries that this is kind of an undercover defence sort of strategy because you know, there's a lot of tension between the West, which Australia has allied itself with, and China and Asia, and so, you know, we know that China is investing more and more in the Pacific and increasing their defence presence there. Australia is looking to build those strategic alliances with the Pacific, and so there's worry that like this is all just kind of platitudes, and what they actually want to do is just increase our defence spending in the area. And, you know, as can be seen by this weird picture on the bottom that I found on the internet, Australia has a very paternalistic relationship with the Pacific. It's very like, we know what's best for you, this is what you need to do to combat climate change, this is what you need to do to adapt. And the Pacific has sort of, they've all kind of come together and said, okay, enough is enough. We want to do this our way. We know what's best for us, and you know, we do need assistance, but we want it to be more on an even playing ground. We want to be more like colleagues instead of, you know, you're the boss and we're just the children who listen to whatever you say. In terms of policy misalignments, these are the key asks this year from the Pacific. So the Pacific at any time can still pull out of their agreement to co-host with Australia, which is why it makes it kind of an iffy standpoint for us. They'll be looking for fossil fuel phase out and the associated policy to ensure that that actually happens. They'll be looking at Australia moving more towards adaptation instead of mitigation, which I think is a bit of a weird one because I feel like we should be doing both at the same time, but I think definitely for the Pacific, like mitigation is sort of, I mean, it's a moot point, like they're already kind of, the curtain's already kind of closed on the Pacific Islands. We know that they won't exist in the form that they are now. They'll be hit by, you know, disaster after disaster, and it'll be really difficult for them to recover. So they're really looking at adaptation. And also climate finance, so the Pacific doesn't want the sort of the loan style climate finance. It's really looking for the grant style, and they're hoping that Australia will kind of push for that in the climate finance negotiation track. So what would, and this is just my opinion, I don't speak on behalf of the Pacific Islands or anything like that, but I think this is sort of the key things that I think we should be looking for to see whether it would be a good co-hosting of a COP. So we would be looking for hopefully good Pacific representation on the Secretariat team. So Australia's already started hiring its COP31 team. You can apply for positions in that team if you'd like. And so, you know, I think even though we are hosting it, the Secretariat has a lot to do with the mechanics and the machinations of the negotiations, and so we'd hope to see either some kind of a shadowing or a pairing where Pacific representatives are directly involved in that Secretariat organisation. Of course, we want to see, policy shifts written in our domestic policy making that mean that we're actually living up to the sorts of, promises that we're making to the Pacific when it comes to climate change. Climate adaptation and climate refugee plans when the Pacific Islands are no more, where do all of those people go? Are we, what is Australia's sort of, as the richest neighbour of the Pacific Islands and a country that has exported a lot of fossil fuels to the rest of the world, what are our sort of obligations to those people who are going to be without a home from no fault of their own doing? Debt-free climate financing, like I said before, and then a shift in our paternalistic relationship with them. So, more like colleagues or co-workers or, some sort of a more collaborative approach rather than Australia just coming in and kind of defining what the Pacific Islands will do. And that is the entire presentation on COP. So I'm happy to answer questions, or I'm happy to just move straight into the AGM. New Zealand in the negotiating blocks. Yeah.
Could you just repeat the question? Sorry.
Oh yes, okay. So where does New Zealand fit in all of this? So New Zealand traditionally will fall in with the Western Europe and others bloc. So it's really interesting to watch in the negotiations. There's these blocks that start forming. So there's the G77 plus China. It's all of the kind of poorest countries in the world, plus China has come in as their sort of, overarching protector. There is then sort of the middle power countries, which is like, Japan, Singapore, Italy, like lots of different places around Europe. Russia sort of comes in and out of the G77. Sometimes it votes with that, sometimes it votes with sort of the middle powers. Australia usually votes alongside the UK, the US, Canada, those kinds of, there will be some times when Australia peels away from that block and votes for different wording in the text, and that's usually when we come in on alongside the Pacific. So it's really interesting to watch the negotiations because you see the draft text on the first day, lots of things happen between the end of that meeting and when everyone sits again the next day. There's lots of corridor deals and, there's private meetings and all of this, and then, people completely shift what they're asking for in the next text, and you go, wait a second, what's happened here? So you can see that like a lot of aid and things like that is tied to what happens in the draft text, and sometimes you see countries completely, go against their own sort of interest, apparent interest, because they'll vote, for certain wording, and you think that's not going to help you at all, but they're looking for consensus, and they have to get the texts in by the end of the second week. It has to be sort of like finalized. So countries will make concessions, and the richer countries will kind of figure out a way to make those countries make concessions in the end. So it's very interesting.
Okay, so we get an agreement. It doesn't seem to be any enforceability.
Yeah, so the question was, we get an agreement, but there doesn't seem to be any enforceability, which is true. So a lot of countries are not on track to meet their 2030 targets, emission reduction targets. It's not enforceable by, the International Criminal Justice Court or anything like that. It's kind of a well-meaning thing, and what the rest of the world relies on is other countries kind of sticking to what they say and adjusting tariffs and the like to sort of encourage the rest of the world to keep up. So you see like some countries in Europe, well, all of the EU has essentially this border adjustment tax, and so they're starting to look at, okay, fine, you don't want to, transition, but anything that you bring into our country, you'll have an adjusted tariff depending on what kind of climate action you've taken in your country, or like how much emissions, like these goods that you're bringing into the country is going to cost. So that's kind of been a new shift to ensure that countries are sort of meeting the mark when it comes to that. But you're right, a lot of it is just sort of platitudes and
so
showing up.
Who's the best at delivering on their promises?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, you could have said sort of Europe was doing really well, but then the war in Ukraine happened. There was an energy shortage, and all of a sudden, like, the carbon mitigation targets were out the window, and they just needed gas to like keep people from freezing over the winter. And so, now they're burning more natural gas, which is a more powerful greenhouse gas, and they've sort of gone backwards on those. So people move up and move back. It depends on the country as well. I mean, New Zealand is a great example of a government being really sort of progressive in their targets, really moving towards, and then you have the next government that comes back and just kind of repeals all of that progress. And so people move forward and backwards. I'm sure there's some kind of report. I'm sure the IPCC has put together, the list of people who are doing the best. Australia isn't doing that great. We're not doing the worst. Azerbaijan, coincidentally, has been rated as one of the worst countries for meeting their climate obligations. So yeah, it's hard to say. Walter?
And is there any target date for richer countries to work out their financial obligations to poorer countries?
Yeah, so the question was, is there any target date for richer countries to meet their obligations to poorer countries? So the new collective quantifiable goal will set out target dates. I think there will be a date to meet in 2030, and then a stretch goal in 2035, but that will be sort of decided on during the negotiations. But I mean, there's something to keep in mind is in 2009, every country on Earth said that they would figure out how to raise $100 billion worth of climate finance by 2025, and we are not on track to meet that at all. Yes, Bruce?
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you as our representative at Azerbaijan. We've been following it with interest. You've been involved with COP now for nearly 10 years by my reckoning, 2015.
Wow, that's weird. Yeah, I guess I have.
So I'd be interested, I know this is a very broad question, but what's your level of confidence in terms of climate action, some of the questions that have just been asked, and then my part B of the question is, Australia has been a laggard, let's be honest. I would have thought that our integrity in terms of COP31 or 51 would be out the window.
Yeah, you would think that.
Just comment on that. Yeah.
I guess I never really give up on like the collective power of people. The irony is not lost on me that I have emitted a lot of carbon emissions flying to the climate conferences. But it's true, right? And it's a lot of it is for show. A lot of it is kind of just ministers parading around and getting high fives and whatever. But I think especially seeing the youth presence grow over the last 3 that I've been to. Also, the Australian government actually funded a number of youth delegates this year, and they didn't have to fund themselves to attend. I think we're seeing more organised youth voices as well. Young people are starting to figure out how these systems work. They're going to the Bonn intercessionals. They're having these kind of like lobbying meetings with different ministers and different negotiators. Some of them are as young as 16. I mean, we have this amazing representative in Amelia Turk. She's from Perth. she will likely be the younger focal point. So in all of the world, she will head up all of like the youth, and that's the key lobby group for young people. And I don't know how she has the energy to do what she does, but she is just a powerhouse. And, you know, I do get kind of, like, we couldn't meet 1.5, and, you know, I'm a firefighter and I see this stuff all the time. I see how much money goes down the drain just by, like, cleaning up after the mess and thinking, you know, I started advocating for climate action in you know, 2012, and it's just like, if we had done something then, we wouldn't have to be spending all this money now. Like, we wouldn't know what we were missing out on. But I don't think it's right to give up hope and just think, oh well, it's not going to happen, because yeah, I think young people in the next generation coming through, they know exactly what they want. They want to see climate action, and I think it's really nice that they're starting to build bridges between countries. They're building alliances between people of their own generations, not so much building alliance to the country that they're from. And so what they're looking for is what's best for everyone, what's a collective goal that we could all, you know, move to together. And so I think they're doing that in a genuine way. Our leaders say that they're doing that, but I feel like sometimes they do that in an ingenuine way. But I think, yeah, it's the best hope that we've got at the moment.
Any other questions, Jeff?
I was wondering when revolution is required. We've been talking for years, and if you look at what's happening in the Pacific, but then more broadly at all of the devastation that is actually happening internationally, and we all understand what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years' time.
Mm-hmm.
This planet's going to be a mess.
Mm-hmm.
When do the people need to rise up and actually try to get some action rather than talking?
Yeah. So for the mic, the question in short was, when does the revolution begin? Yeah, I mean, probably 5 or 10 years ago would have been a great time. I think there is definitely room for more active lobbying. I really like the work that groups like Extinction Rebellion do, where they kind of, you know, it's like, oh, we're disrupting a highway for a day. Like, imagine what happens when, you know, you can't get out of your town for weeks on end because, you know, there's been a bushfire that's come through and just like knocked over 1 million trees. I think those actions are powerful, and they get a conversation starting. I like what Global Voices does in a more sort of, I guess, subtle sense, but putting forward, okay, well, if these, you know, 8 young people were decision makers today, this is the kind of policy that they would like to see. And by the way, they represent the biggest generation that there's ever been in Australia. So when you think about voting power, this is what you're going to have to move to if you want to sort of stay in power. You know, there's progressive groups out there. There's progressive political parties who actually have very good climate policies that sort of stick to the fringes. But it's everyone doing as much as they can. And, you know, these kinds of groups are amazing. And I think I used to worry, you know, like, I'm not doing everything perfect and I've used plastic today and blah, blah, blah. But I feel like the world needs everyone doing sort of the work imperfectly instead of a few people just doing it perfectly. So yeah, but, you know, Jeff, when you want to start that revolution, I'll be there. I'll be painting the signs. Don't worry. I'll get the flag out. Yeah.
I think we should probably move on now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. It's the world is in turmoil, isn't it? And it's very heartening to hear people like you and young people who are trying to make a difference and do something. And all the best with your trip tomorrow and the next one. And
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for having me.
a little bit of cold.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come and sit down and join us.
Yeah, yeah.